The deed was dated 2 years back, but the debt was older than that. Older than the ink, older than the courthouse that stamped it, older than the shame Elara had carried since the morning she buried her husband in frozen ground and watched his brother ride away with everything that wasn't nailed down. She stood in the mud outside the land office in Caldwell, crossing with 17 cents in her coat pocket, and a piece of paper in her hand that said she owed Silas Potts $412 by the 1st of March, or the land. Her land, her husband's land, the land with his grave on the north corner, would pass to him without argument. $412, she'd have had better lucks pulling gold out of the sky. The man behind the counter had looked at her with something that wasn't quite pity and wasn't quite indifference. He'd told her she could sign the property over now and save herself the winter. She'd folded the paper, put it in her coat pocket next to the 17 cents, and walked out without a word. It was already late October. The aspen had gone yellow, and the nights were hard enough to split rock. She had a mule, a half-empty root cellar, and no clear plan. What she had, mostly, was the stubbornness of a woman who had nothing left to lose. She didn't know about Cord yet. She first heard his name from the woman who ran the dry goods store on the edge of town, a sharp-faced widow named Abigail who weighed flour like she was weighing sins, and didn't give credit to anyone. "There's a man up on the ridge," Abigail said, not looking up from her ledger. "Past the switchback, lives alone. Traps, mostly. Brings in good pelts every winter, pays in coin." She paused. "Word is he's looking for someone to work the cabin through the season. Cook, clean, keep the fire. His hands went bad, frostbite 2 winters back. Can't work the pelts the way he used to." Elara stood very still. "He pays?" she asked. "He paid the Hennessy boy $3 a month last winter." "Boy quit in December," said the man, never spoke a word in 3 weeks. "That doesn't bother me." Abigail finally looked up. She studied Elara for a long moment. The thin coat, the boots with the cracked sole, the particular set of a jaw that has made a decision before the mouth has caught up with it. "He's not a gentleman," Abigail said, not as a warning, more like a fact. "The way you'd say the weather is cold or the river runs fast. I'm not looking for gentle," Elara said. "I'm looking for $400 by March." Abigail wrote the directions on the back of a receipt. The switchback road was worse than Abigail described. Elara's mule, a grey animal, named nothing, because she'd never seen the point in naming things she might have to sell, picked his way up the frozen track with the patience of something that had lived a long life and expected very little from it. It took most of a day. The cabin sat in a clearing, backed against a granite outcrop, low and square and serious, like a man who didn't waste words. Smoke from the chimney, a stack of split wood taller than the eave. Pelts stretched on frames along the south wall, 6 of them, cured and ready. Someone up here knew what they were doing. She stopped at the edge of the clearing and waited. He came out of the barn after a minute. Big. That was the first word her mind produced, and it didn't fully cover it. He was the kind of large that made the clearing feel smaller, not in a threatening way, but in the way a mountain is large. Simply present, simply immovable. Dark coat, a beard going grey at the edges. He walked with a slight drag to his left leg, old injury, she guessed, and he stopped when he saw her and didn't move again. They looked at each other across the frozen mud of the clearing. "Abigail sent me," Elara said. He said nothing. "I heard you need someone through the winter. To work the cabin." Still nothing. His eyes moved to the mule, then back to her, then to the cracked sole of her boot, which she wished he hadn't noticed. "I cook well," she said. "I can cure a pelt, I can set a snare, and I don't need conversation." Something in his face shifted, not a smile, more like a recalibration. 4 months, he said. His voice was low and unexpectedly careful, like a man who chose words the way you choose footing on ice. "December through March. $30 a month. $120. Not enough for the debt, but enough for something. Enough to begin. I need 120 by March," she said. That works. It's not a negotiation, he said. It's just what I pay. I know, I said it works. He looked at her for another long moment, then turned and walked back toward the barn. She took that as yes. His name was Cord. She learned it from a letter she found, tacked to the inside of the cabin door, addressed to C. Mallory, dated 3 years ago, never opened. She didn't read it. It wasn't hers to read, but the name settled into her mind and stayed there. The cabin was clean in the way of a man who lived alone and valued order more than comfort. Everything in its place. Nothing decorative. A single window on the south wall that let in the afternoon light, a table, 2 chairs, a wood stove that threw serious heat. Her sleeping space was a loft above the main room. A pallet, 2 wool blankets, a peg on the wall. It wasn't kind, but it was shelter. She cooked the first dinner in silence. Salt pork, dried beans, cornbread from the half bag of meal she found in the dry larder. He sat at the table and ate without comment. She sat across from him and ate without comment. The fire popped. Outside, the wind picked up. When she was done, she washed the dishes and went up to the loft. She lay in the dark and listened to the wind work at the corners of the cabin, and thought about the deed in her coat pocket, and the grave on the north corner of her land, and the way Silas Potts had smiled at her in the courthouse, like a man who already owned something and was simply waiting for the paperwork to confirm it. She wasn't going to let him have it. She wasn't. She fell asleep with her jaw set and didn't move till morning. The first weeks were a kind of negotiation without words. She learned his routines. Up before light, out to the trap lines before she had the coffee on, back by mid-morning, silent through the afternoon work, a brief and serious dinner, then the chair by the fire, and a book she could never quite read the spine of. He learned hers. She needed quiet in the morning, and would talk a little in the evenings if something had actually happened worth talking about. She put a second chair closer to the fire without asking. He didn't move it back. She found the rhythm of it. That surprised her. What surprised her more was the hands. He'd mentioned frostbite, but she hadn't understood what that meant until she watched him try to work the laces on a pelt frame one afternoon, and saw how his right hand wouldn't close fully, how the last 2 fingers sat at a permanent slight angle, how he compensated with his palm and wrist in a way that was clearly practiced and clearly painful. She didn't say anything, but after that, she started laying the pelt frames out in a different order, the ones that needed fine lacing already threaded, so he could work them with less grip. He didn't mention it. She didn't mention it, but the frames got done faster, and his jaw was less tight at dinner. That was November. December came hard. Snow in the first week. Deep enough to change the shape of the clearing, to make the world smaller and quieter in the particular way of deep winter, sounds muffled, distances shortened, the world compressing down to what you could see from the window. Elara baked bread when the flour held. She repaired a section of the south wall where the chinking had gone soft. She found a mouse nest in the dry larder and relocated it with significantly less ceremony than the mice would have preferred. Cord trapped, brought in beaver, mink, twice a silver fox. A good season, he said one evening, the longest sentence she'd heard from him. She asked how he knew when it was good. He considered the question with the same seriousness. He gave everything. When the lines are busy, he said, the animals are moving. When they're moving, the winter's going to be long. They know it before we do. She thought about that. So a good season is actually a warning. He looked at her. Yes, he said. That's exactly what it is. She felt something shift between them, small as a coin tilting on its edge. She told herself it was just the cold, making everything feel larger than it was. It was the second week of January when she slipped on the ice at the woodpile. Not a bad fall. She caught herself on the stack, bruised her palm, jarred her knee, but Cord saw it from the barn doorway and crossed the clearing in about 6 strides, which was faster than she would have thought he could move. He didn't ask if she was fine. He looked at her knee, her palm, the way she was standing. "Walk," he said. She walked. "Good," he said. Then he took the armload of wood out of her hands without explanation and carried it inside. She stood in the cold for a moment and felt something that she hadn't felt in a long time. She wasn't sure she had a name for it right away. Later she thought maybe it was the feeling of being looked at by someone who was actually looking. February brought the cold that ended arguments. 20 below on the clearest nights, the kind of cold that made the cabin timbers contract and pop and groan like a ship in heavy water. She stopped going out except when necessary. Cord cut back the trap lines to the nearest runs and worked mostly from the barn. They spent more time in the same room. It didn't make her uncomfortable exactly. It made her aware of where he was in the space, aware of the sound of his breathing when he read in the evening, aware that he had started watching her, sometimes, when she was at the stove, not in a way that felt threatening, but in a way that felt, she didn't know the word, attending, like something listening very carefully. She asked him one evening, flat out, "Were you ever married?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. "Briefly," he said, "a long time ago. She didn't want this." He moved one hand, a gesture that took in the cabin, the mountains, all of it. "I didn't blame her. Do you miss her?" "No," he said it without rancor. "I miss the idea of it, sometimes. Having someone." Elara looked at the fire. "I had someone," she said. "For 6 years, it was good." She paused. "Then he got sick, and it was still good, just harder. And then he was gone, and his family came and took everything they thought they could carry, and I was left with the land and a debt I didn't know existed." Cord was quiet. "That's why March matters," she said. He looked at her then. Directly, fully, in a way he rarely allowed himself. "You'll have the money," he said. It wasn't a consolation. It was a fact. The same tone he used for everything he was sure of. She nodded and didn't say anything else, and the fire went on burning, and the wind went on working at the corners of the cabin, and somehow the night felt less cold than it had before. The note arrived on the 3rd of February, carried up by the Caldwell Crossing mail rider, who made the trek once a month regardless of weather. A small, iron-willed man named Potts, who had no relation to Silas, and who handed her the envelope with the impersonal efficiency of someone who delivered both good news and bad, and had learned not to distinguish between them. She opened it at the table while Cord was in the barn. Silas had moved the deadline. January 31st, the note said, already passed. Due to failure to make payment or contact, the property had been assessed and was now in process of transfer. She read it twice, then a third time, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something that made sense. They didn't. She was still sitting at the table with the letter in her hands when Cord came in. He saw her face before he saw the paper. He sat down across from her without being asked and waited. She handed him the letter. He read it slowly. His expression didn't change, which she had learned meant he was actually very affected. "He moved the date," she said. Her voice was steadier than she felt. "I never missed a deadline. He simply moved it." Cord set the letter on the table. "Is there a courthouse?" he asked. "In Caldwell Crossing. But Silas has the judges." She stopped. "It doesn't matter who he has. I have the original deed. I have the original note with the original date." She pressed her hands flat on the table. "I have standing. Then we go down in the morning." She looked at him. "You don't have to." "I have business in town," he said. "I'll take the wagon." It was the most obvious lie she'd ever heard. He hadn't been to town in 3 months. But she didn't argue. They went down in the morning. The road was ice over frozen mud, and the wagon moved carefully, and they sat side by side on the bench without talking much, which by then was simply their way. The courthouse in Caldwell Crossing was a 1-story building that smelled of wood stain and cold ambition. Silas was there. Of course he was there. He was the kind of man who enjoyed being in the room when things went in his favor. He looked at Elara with the particular smile of a man who has already celebrated. Then he looked at Cord. The smile recalibrated. Cord said nothing. He stood just behind Elara's shoulder with his arms at his sides, and his expression neutral, and the effect was, she would think about this later, not threatening exactly. More like a mountain being present. You didn't argue with a mountain. You simply noted it was there. The judge, a thin man with tired eyes who clearly wished he were somewhere else, listened to Elara's argument. Original deed, original note, original date. She laid the papers on his desk in the right order and spoke in the clear, measured tone of a woman who had rehearsed this in her head all winter, who had not let herself imagine failure, because failure was not a thing she had room for. Silas tried to talk over her twice. Both times, the judge asked him to wait. It took 2 hours. At the end of it, the judge ruled in her favor. The transfer of property was invalidated, the original deadline restored. Elara had until March 1st. Silas walked out without speaking. He didn't look at Cord. That was, she thought, a kind of answer in itself. Outside on the courthouse steps, in the thin February sunlight, she stood for a moment and let herself breathe. "Thank you," she said to Cord, "for coming." "I had business," he said. "You had no business." A pause. "No," he said, "I didn't." She paid the debt on the 22nd of February, 6 days early. $120 from Cord's wages, $80 she had saved from her husband's last harvest that Silas's family hadn't found, the rest from the sale of a silver fox, pelt that Cord, without discussion, told her was hers to sell. The courthouse clerk stamped the deed paid in full and handed it back to her, and that was all, no ceremony. Just an ink stamp and a piece of paper that now meant something again. She rode back up the mountain with the deed in her inside pocket, against her chest, where she could feel the folded edge of it with every breath. The last week of February, she started packing. She didn't make a show of it. The mule needed grooming anyway, and she began shifting her few things to the barn, organized, ready. It was what she'd come to do. She'd done it. March was almost here. The cabin was hers again, and she had a life to return to. Sparse as it was, fractured as it was hers. Cord watched her for 3 days without comment. On the 4th day, he came in from the trap lines earlier than usual and sat down at the table and didn't take off his coat, which meant he was working up to something. She waited. "The south fence needs rebuilding before spring," he said, "and I can't work the finer wire with these hands." She looked at him. "I know," she said. "There's the garden plot east of the barn. It would hold if someone put it in right." He paused. "I've never been able to make things grow. I don't have the attention for it." "I know that too," she said. The fire was low. She put another piece of wood in without thinking, the way you do when you've learned where the fire needs tending. "What are you asking, Cord?" she said, quietly, not unkind. He was quiet for a moment that stretched out long and serious, the way he was when he was choosing words that mattered. "I'm asking if you want to stay," he said. "Not as a worker, not for wages." He looked at the table, then up at her. "As whatever you want to call it. Someone who lives here. Someone who—" He stopped, started again. "Someone the cabin belongs to as much as it belongs to me." The clock on the shelf ticked. Outside, the wind moved through the pines, a sound she had learned this winter. Not threatening, just present, the voice of the mountain going about its business. She thought about the deed in her coat pocket, the grave on the north corner, the 6 years that had been good, and the year after them that had been hard, and the winter on this mountain that had been harder still, and somehow, had given her something back she hadn't known she was missing. She thought about the fence that needed mending, the garden that could grow east of the barn if someone had the attention for it. She thought about the way he'd crossed the clearing in 6 strides when she slipped on the ice. "I have a property," she said, "my own land. I can't just leave it." "I know," he said it, without flinching. "I'm not asking you to leave it." She looked at him. "What are you asking then?" "I'm asking if you want both," he said. "Your land and this, if you want." He cleared his throat. "I'm asking if you want a reason to come back." The fire settled. The clock ticked. Elara looked at this man. rough and quiet, and scarred in ways he didn't talk about, large enough to fill a doorway and careful enough to thread a pelt frame, so she didn't have to watch him struggle. And she thought about a word she hadn't used in a year. Home. Not a place, a feeling, the particular weight of belonging somewhere. She reached into her coat pocket and found the edge of the deed, the paper that had cost her a winter and her pride and $30 a month, and something else she didn't have a name for yet. She put it on the table between them. My land borders the river at the south end, she said. Good bottom soil, spring floods, but you can work around it. He looked at the deed, then at her. Is that a yes? He said. She almost smiled. For a man of almost no words, he had asked that with the directness of someone who had been practicing it all winter. That's a yes, she said. He nodded once, the way he confirmed everything, quietly, completely, as if the thing were already true and simply needed acknowledging. Outside, February was ending. The mountain was still cold, still serious, still itself. But somewhere in the pines to the east, a bird was making the small, tentative sound that birds make when they're deciding whether spring is real yet. It wasn't spring, not quite, but it was close enough to begin.